Everyone knows about the Waffen-SS. Most people have heard the stories. The elite formations, the feared reputation, the iron discipline, the near-mythological status they built on battlefields from France to the Soviet Union. But almost no one knows about the friction that existed just beneath the surface. The quiet, grinding, corrosive rivalry between those black-collar divisions and the regular German army that fought right alongside them. Not in newspaper headlines, not in the post-war memoirs that got the most attention, but in supply depots, in field telephone calls, in written complaints buried in dusty Wehrmacht archives that most historians never had reason to dig through. What you are about to hear is the story of that friction. The real story of why Waffen-SS units repeatedly refused to share ammunition caches with Wehrmacht divisions on the Eastern Front. Not rumors, not propaganda, not simplified mythology from either side, but the documented, verified, deeply uncomfortable truth about what happened when two armies that were supposed to be fighting the same war couldn't agree on who deserved to survive the next morning. If this kind of deep operational history is what you're here for, make sure you hit subscribe right now so you never miss a piece of it. Because this isn't a simple story. It isn't just about bullets and boxes. It's about ideology dressed up as logistics. It's about institutional identity, weaponized in the middle of a war. It's about what happens when political loyalty and military necessity collide on the worst battlefield in human history. And it happened more often than almost anyone realizes. To understand why any of this occurred, you have to understand what the Waffen-SS actually was, and more importantly, what it believed it was. Because those two things were not always the same. The Waffen-SS, the armed wing of the SS, did not begin as a conventional military force. It began as an ideological bodyguard. Heinrich Himmler's obsession, a fighting organization that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of National Socialist racial purity, physical perfection, and ideological dedication. Every aspect of its structure, its recruitment, its training, its internal culture, was designed to reinforce one central idea, that these men were not simply soldiers. They were warrior knights of the new Germanic order, an elite above elites, something that the Wehrmacht, with its Prussian traditions and professional officer corps, simply was not. Now this created a problem almost immediately, because the Wehrmacht had its own identity, its own traditions stretching back through the Imperial German Army, through the Franco-Prussian War, through the Napoleonic era. The Prussian officer corps did not consider itself inferior to anyone, and it certainly did not consider a political paramilitary organization built by a former chicken farmer from Bavaria to be its equal, much less its superior. From the very beginning of the war, this tension simmered. In Poland, it exploded briefly when Wehrmacht officers witnessed SS units committing atrocities against civilians and reported it up their chain of command. Those reports went nowhere. The conflict was papered over. But it did not disappear. It hardened. It calcified. And by the time Germany turned east in June of 1941, both institutions had developed genuine contempt for each other that was only partially hidden under the surface of military cooperation. Operation Barbarossa made everything worse. The sheer scale of the Eastern Front, the distances involved, the speed of the initial advance, the catastrophic demands on supply and logistics, all of it meant that resources were never sufficient. German logistics were inadequate from the first week. The Wehrmacht had planned for a campaign of roughly 12 weeks. When that timeline collapsed, the supply system began to fracture. Ammunition, fuel, food, winter clothing, everything existed in quantities calculated for a short, victorious war. When that war became something else entirely, the competition for those scarce resources became savage. And into that environment, you introduced an institution that genuinely believed it deserved priority. The Waffen-SS relationship with Wehrmacht logistics was unique and deeply contested from the beginning. On paper, Waffen-SS formations in the field were supposed to fall under Wehrmacht operational command. The SS Panzer Corps, the Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, all of these formations were assigned to army groups, placed within larger German operational frameworks, and were expected to function as part of the broader military machine. But the supply chain for Waffen-SS units ran through a completely separate administrative structure. Their equipment came through SS channels, their replacements came through SS channels, their heavy weapons, their vehicles, their fuel allocations, all of it tracked back to a parallel bureaucracy that answered to Himmler's SS main office, not to the Wehrmacht's Oberkommando des Heeres, the Army High Command. This meant two things. First, Waffen-SS divisions were frequently better equipped than comparable Wehrmacht units, particularly as the war dragged on and Germany's industrial output began to strain under Allied bombing and raw material shortages. The SS used its political influence to ensure its formations received priority access to new tanks, new weapons, new vehicles. By 1943, when most Wehrmacht infantry divisions were lucky to have the equipment they started the war with, SS Panzer divisions were receiving Tiger tanks and the latest assault guns, while comparable Army armored formations waited months for the same hardware. Second, and this is the critical part, the separate supply chain created a situation where SS units operating alongside Wehrmacht formations controlled resources that the Army units genuinely needed. When an SS ammunition depot was located in the same operational area as Wehrmacht divisions that were running low on critical calibers, the question of sharing was never automatic. It was political, it was ideological, and often the answer was no. To understand how that played out in practice, you need to look at specific moments on the Eastern Front where the friction became documented, reported, and in some cases, catastrophic. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was perhaps the most brutal environment in which this dynamic first truly revealed itself. The German advance had stalled. Army Group Center had come within sight of Moscow and then been hammered by Soviet counteroffensives that drove the Wehrmacht back with massive casualties. German units were desperately short of almost everything. Ammunition consumption had far exceeded projections. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of kilometers through Russian winter conditions that had already immobilized significant portions of the transport infrastructure. In this environment, Wehrmacht divisions fighting alongside SS units found themselves in a nightmarish position. They were in contact with the enemy, they were taking casualties, and the ammunition reserves they needed were in some cases physically present in supply dumps that SS formations controlled and refused to release through Wehrmacht supply channels. The reasoning from the SS side was not entirely without logic if you bracket off the ideology for a moment. SS commanders argued that their formations were frequently assigned the most critical assault tasks, the spearhead roles, the breakthrough operations, the counterattack missions that required the highest ammunition consumption. They needed full magazines and full shell racks going into those engagements. To release reserves to Wehrmacht units that might use them inefficiently or lose them to Soviet capture was, in their framing, a waste of resources that could cost the entire operation. Every SS division commander knew that his formation's performance was being watched directly by Hitler and by Himmler. A failed attack, because his units ran out of ammunition, would have consequences that went beyond military. It would be a political failure, an ideological failure. The elite had stumbled. But the Wehrmacht side of that equation was equally desperate. Regular Army infantry divisions holding defensive lines in the Soviet winter were watching their ammunition states fall to dangerous levels. Supply requests went through proper channels. Sometimes they were answered. Sometimes they were not, and when Wehrmacht officers could physically see SS ammunition stockpiles being guarded and not redistributed to units that needed them, the resentment was not abstract. It was visceral. It was the kind of resentment that generates formal written complaints, which is precisely what happened. The German military archive system, the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, contains dozens of documented complaints from this period. Wehrmacht Corps and Army headquarters registered formal protests with Army group commands about SS units refusing to share or release captured Soviet ammunition stocks, German artillery shells, and small arms ammunition reserves. The complaints were carefully worded, as military paperwork tends to be, but the anger underneath the bureaucratic language is unmistakable. Phrases like uncooperative behavior contrary to operational necessity appear repeatedly. Notes about SS unit commanders failing to respond to direct requests from Army Corps headquarters. Records of Wehrmacht liaison officers being denied access to SS supply areas. What is striking about these documents is not just that the complaints existed, it is that they frequently went nowhere. Army group commanders were in an impossible position. The Waffen-SS formations were under their operational command, but disciplinary authority over SS officers rested with Himmler's organization. An army general could request that an SS division commander comply with supply sharing orders. He could not relieve that officer, court-martial him, or impose consequences in the way he could with a Wehrmacht subordinate. The parallel command structure insulated SS officers from the consequences that would have applied to any Wehrmacht officer who behaved the same way. And this was not accidental. It was designed. Himmler had spent years carefully constructing a situation where his armed SS formations would be available for military operations, but would remain ultimately answerable to him rather than to the army. The ammunition hoarding was, in many ways, simply a tactical expression of that structural reality. The situation around Kharkov in early 1943 provides one of the clearest windows into how this dynamic operated at the operational level. The Second Battle of Kharkov in May of 1942, and the subsequent Soviet recapture of the city in February 1943, and then the German recapture in March 1943, created an extraordinarily fluid and violent period of operations in which supply allocation became genuinely life or death for the formations involved. The SS Panzer Corps, comprising the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions, played the central role in the March 1943 German recapture of Kharkov. This operation, conceived and executed largely by SS General Paul Hauser after his controversial decision to abandon the city initially, became one of the most celebrated German tactical successes of the later war years. For the SS, it was a propaganda triumph. For Himmler and Goebbels, it was proof that the SS Warrior Knight concept produced results that regular army formations could not. But what the propaganda did not discuss was the brutal calculus that preceded those victories. In the weeks leading up to the counterattack, the SS Panzer Corps was being resupplied and rebuilt, while Wehrmacht infantry formations in the same operational area were being stripped of replacements and priority supply access to ensure the SS units could execute the operation. Wehrmacht divisions holding the flanks of the SS operation recorded significant ammunition shortfalls. Several Army infantry units reported that requests for additional artillery ammunition were denied at Army group level, specifically because the available stocks were being reserved for SS armored operations. The logic was militarily coherent in a narrow sense. You put your best equipped, best supplied formation at the point of greatest opportunity. But the human cost of that logic fell on Wehrmacht soldiers in the supporting positions who were holding their lines with dwindling resources while the SS stockpiled for their moment of glory. And the SS was not subtle about the priority. SS supply officers were documented as refusing to release stocks to Wehrmacht units even when army commanders presented formal requisition orders. The parallel supply chain meant that an SS Hauptsturmführer controlling a depot could simply decline to recognize the authority of an army logistics officer, and the army had no effective recourse. This was the texture of the friction, not always dramatic, not always a shouted argument in the snow, often just a piece of paper stamped with a refusal and no further explanation, delivered by an Esesnenko who knew perfectly well that the Wehrmacht colonel, standing in front of him, could do nothing about it. The ideology behind this behavior was not merely organizational arrogance. It went deeper. SS formations had been indoctrinated with a genuine belief that the Wehrmacht was a lesser institution, not in terms of courage or tactical skill necessarily, but in terms of ideological purity, racial quality, and ultimate political reliability. The SS internal culture framed the Wehrmacht as the old Germany, conservative, tied to aristocratic and bourgeois traditions, not fully committed to the National Socialist Revolution. The SS saw itself as the new Germany, the future, and that framing had practical consequences for how SS officers thought about resource allocation. If you genuinely believe that your formation is both militarily superior and ideologically superior, and if you exist in a command structure that reinforces that belief daily, then the idea of transferring your ammunition to what you privately consider a lesser force becomes philosophically uncomfortable, not just strategically questionable. Why give your bullets to an institution you don't fully trust? Why weaken yourself to prop up an army that, in the SS worldview, might not even deserve to win if it couldn't manage its own supplies? This thinking was never stated openly in official documents. It could not be, because officially the Wehrmacht and SS were fighting the same war for the same Germany. But it surfaces in the diaries and memoirs of SS officers, in the private letters that survived the war, and in the testimony gathered by post-war investigators. The contempt was real, the institutional tribalism was real, and it shaped decisions that cost lives. The summer of 1943 and the operation around Kursk deepened these dynamics in ways that would have lasting consequences. Operation Citadel, the German attempt to eliminate the Kursk salient in July 1943, represented the largest concentration of German armored power assembled since Barbarossa. and within that concentration, the SS Panzer Corps, now redesignated as the SCSES Panzer Corps and reinforced with additional formations, was the crown jewel. Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf were equipped with the latest German armor, including the new Tiger and Panther tanks, and had received months of priority resupply and reinforcement at the expense of other formations. Wehrmacht panzer formations participating in the same operation were not as fortunate. The contrast in equipment quality between SS and Army armored units at Kursk was visible and measurable. Wehrmacht tank crews operating older Panzer III and IV variants alongside SS crews in Tigers felt the disparity acutely. More critically, the ammunition consumption rates for the heavy SS tanks meant that SS supply officers were extraordinarily protective of the specialized ammunition stocks for their formations. The 88mm rounds for Tiger tanks, the ammunition for the new Panther, these were not interchangeable with what Wehrmacht units needed, but the broader supplies, diesel fuel, small arms ammunition, artillery shells in common calibers, existed in conditions where sharing was theoretically possible and practically refused. Army officers attached as liaison to the IIS's Panzer Corps during Citadel recorded frustrating interactions with SS supply personnel. Requests for emergency ammunition transfers when Army units in adjacent sectors ran critically low were met with formal denials, citing the SS Corps commander's orders to maintain full operational reserves. The SS divisions were not going to enter the greatest tank battle of the war with anything less than maximum ammunition loads, regardless of what was happening to the Army units around them. From a purely tactical standpoint, you can construct an argument for that position. From a joint operational standpoint, it was a problem that cost German flexibility at exactly the moment when flexibility mattered most. Prokhorovka, the massive tank engagement on July 12, 1943, is often cited as the turning point of Kursk, though historians continue to debate its precise operational significance. What is less debated is that in the aftermath of the failed Citadel operation, German forces in the south faced a severe ammunition and supply crisis. Soviet offensive operations following the German failure at Kursk drove Wehrmacht and SS formations into defensive postures that consumed ammunition at unsustainable rates. In this period, the ammunition hoarding dynamic reached its most acute expression. SS formations falling back toward defensive lines consistently prioritized their own supply states. Wehrmacht units plugging gaps in the line alongside SS divisions reported in formal after-action records that requests for emergency ammunition transfers from SS depots were denied on multiple occasions, even when the Wehrmacht units were in danger of being overrun. Several post-battle investigations by Army Group South headquarters noted specific instances where Wehrmacht infantry positions had collapsed, partly due to ammunition exhaustion, while SS formations in the same operational area maintained substantial reserves. The investigations produced recommendations but no consequences for the SS officers involved. The parallel command structure continued to insulate them. It would be a mistake to view this entirely as a one-dimensional story of SS villainy and Wehrmacht victimhood. The reality was considerably more complicated, and honest history demands that complexity be acknowledged. Wehrmacht formations were not innocent participants in the broader dynamics of German military dysfunction. Regular army units also hoarded supplies when they could, also manipulated logistics reports to conceal reserves, also prioritized their own formations over adjacent units when the pressure was highest. The Eastern Front created survival instincts in every formation that operated there, and those instincts frequently overrode official orders about supply cooperation. An Army division commander, watching his unit's ammunition state fall, knew that his next resupply might not come for days or weeks. Releasing what little he had to someone else was a decision that could get his own men killed. What made the SS situation distinct was not that it happened. Supply hoarding was universal. What made it distinct was the structural and ideological reinforcement behind it. Wehrmacht hoarding was opportunistic and desperate. SS hoarding was systematic, supported by a parallel supply infrastructure, and ideologically justified. That is a meaningful difference in degree and in kind. There were also examples of genuine operational cooperation between SS and Wehrmacht formations, moments when the institutional friction was subordinated to immediate necessity, and both organizations functioned as parts of a coherent fighting force. The defensive battles in the Ukraine in 1943 and 1944 produced some documented instances of SS units providing ammunition support to Wehrmacht formations in extremis, usually under the direct order of a theater commander with sufficient authority and political standing to compel compliance. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, commanding Army Group South, was one of the few Wehrmacht commanders who could reliably impose operational discipline on SS formations in his sector. His relationship with Himmler was tense, but functional, and he was willing to go directly to Hitler when SS commanders failed to comply with his operational orders. Under Manstein's authority, the supply friction was not eliminated, but it was managed with more effectiveness than under commanders who lacked his political standing and personal forcefulness. The problem was that Manstein was exceptional. Not every army group commander had his ability to navigate the politics. Many Wehrmacht generals had learned through painful experience that confronting SS commanders directly produced more paperwork than results, and occasionally resulted in personal political consequences that could end careers. The Demyansk Pocket in 1942 provides an illuminating case study that is less well known than some of the larger operational episodes, but is particularly well documented. The pocket, formed when Soviet operations encircled roughly 90,000 German troops, including Waffen-SS Totenkopf Division in the Lake Ilmen region, created a desperate situation in which supply by air and eventual ground corridor were the only lifelines for the trapped forces. Within the pocket, the competition for supplies that were being flown in under fire became a constant source of friction. Totenkopf Division, despite being in the same desperate situation as the Wehrmacht units around it, maintained a degree of organizational discipline and supply management that Wehrmacht officers found both impressive and infuriating in equal measure. SS supply officers tracked their formation's consumption with precision and resisted any redistribution of SS-allocated supplies to army units with a consistency that, under the circumstances, seemed almost surreal. Survivors and post-war accounts describe Wehrmacht officers making direct personal appeals to SS officers in the pocket for ammunition sharing and being refused with what one German general described as an almost ceremonial politeness that left no doubt the answer was final, regardless of what argument was offered. The SS men were genuinely fighting for their lives alongside the Wehrmacht soldiers making those requests. They were under the same Soviet bombardment. They were suffering the same supply shortages in absolute terms. And yet the institutional reflex to maintain SS supply sovereignty persisted even in conditions of mutual near annihilation. This behavioral pattern reveals something important about how completely the SS indoctrination had taken hold. When men who are fighting for survival in the same frozen pocket still maintain institutional boundaries around their ammunition, the ideology has ceased to be a performance and has become a genuine operating principle. The Totenkopf soldiers were not calculating the political benefits of supply separation in the Demyansk pocket. They were operating on a reflex so deeply ingrained that it persisted under conditions designed to dissolve all other social conditioning. The ammunition issue also intersected with a related problem that made the overall supply dynamic even more dysfunctional: the SS use of captured Soviet and other non-standard ammunition. As German forces advanced deep into Soviet territory, they captured enormous stocks of Red Army supplies, ammunition dumps, fuel depots, food stores, medical supplies. The distribution of captured materials was, on paper, supposed to be coordinated through Army Group supply channels to ensure fair allocation across all formations in the operational area. In practice, SS formations that captured significant supply dumps frequently incorporated those materials into their own supply chain rather than reporting them for redistribution. Wehrmacht units, often fighting to capture the same objectives and suffering casualties in the process, found that the SS formations advancing alongside them or behind them had already stripped what was useful before Army logistics teams could catalog and redistribute it. From the SS perspective, this was simply efficient logistics. Your men captured it. Your men need it. Why pass it up the chain to a bureaucracy that might redistribute it away from the formation that did the fighting? The SS soldier culture explicitly celebrated self-sufficiency and unit loyalty. Taking care of your own through whatever means were available was entirely consistent with the SS ethos. For the Wehrmacht supply officers trying to maintain rational distribution across a front that stretched thousands of kilometers, it was a systematic undermining of the coordination on which joint operations depended. You cannot plan an operation if you don't know what supplies are actually available, because one of your major formations is maintaining undeclared reserves off the books. By 1944, the supply situation on the Eastern Front had deteriorated to the point where the friction between SS and Wehrmacht logistics was no longer just operationally damaging. It was approaching the catastrophic. The Soviet offensives that began with Bagration in June 1944 tore enormous holes in German positions, and the subsequent retreats created supply chain chaos of a scale that made the earlier frictions seem manageable in comparison. In the Baltic region, in the Ukraine, in Romania, German formations retreating under constant Soviet pressure found themselves competing for the dwindling resources flowing through a supply system that was being physically destroyed by Soviet advances and Allied bombing of German railways and depots. In this environment, the SS supply priority created situations that Wehrmacht commanders described in their reports with increasing desperation. The retreat through the Ukraine produced documented instances of SS formations commandeering Wehrmacht transport to move their own supplies rearward. Regular army units watching SS trucks loaded with ammunition driving past their stationary, fuelless vehicles toward safety, while they were left to fight off Soviet pursuit with whatever ammunition remained in their vehicles, experienced a level of institutional betrayal that generated some of the most acidly worded official complaints in the German military archive record. One particularly striking document, a formal protest filed by an Army Corps commander in the fall of 1944, describes with barely contained fury how an SS supply column had passed through his corps area, moving rearward, while his infantry divisions were conducting a fighting withdrawal with ammunition states below 30% across multiple calibers. His request to divert some of the SS supply column to his units had been refused by the SS column commander, who cited orders from his SS division's logistics officer. The protest notes with considerable precision that the SS division in question had been in reserve for the preceding 3 weeks and had not been in contact with the enemy, while his corps had been in continuous combat for over a month. The implication, carefully not stated directly, was that the SS were moving fully stocked reserves out of an area, while the men who had actually been fighting were left to manage with what remained. Army Group Command received the protest, acknowledged it, and took no effective action that changed the situation on the ground. The dynamics around Budapest in the winter of 1944 to 1945 represent perhaps the most operationally significant instance of the SS ammunition supply problem. The Siege of Budapest, which began in December 1944, when Soviet forces encircled the Hungarian capital and the German and Hungarian garrison within it, created a nightmarish situation for the trapped forces. Among those forces were significant SS and Army units, and the competition for supplies being airdropped into the pocket produced friction that directly contributed to the operational failure of the defense. The IVS's Panzer Corps was committed to the relief operations outside the pocket, attempting to break through Soviet lines and relieve the garrison. The priority given to maintaining those forces' supply state meant that the units actually fighting inside the pocket frequently received lower priority in the aerial resupply allocation. Wehrmacht officers inside Budapest recorded with increasing desperation that supply drops were insufficient and that whatever arrived was distributed according to priorities that seemed to favor SS formations over Army units, even within the pocket itself. The breakout attempt in February 1945, in which roughly 28,000 troops attempted to fight their way out of the encirclement, was characterized by every formation for itself, thinking that had become the practical reality of German military operations by that stage. Those who survived described a desperate movement in which unit cohesion above the platoon level largely collapsed, and the institutional structures that had made supply friction a bureaucratic problem became irrelevant because there was no longer any functioning supply system at all. Men fought with what they carried. The questions that had been argued in depot commandant offices and corps headquarters for 3 years were resolved by simple mathematics. You had what you had, and when it was gone, it was gone. The post-war examination of these dynamics took place in several different contexts, each of which illuminated different aspects of what had happened. The Nuremberg proceedings against SS leadership produced extensive testimony about the Waffen-SS's administrative and organizational independence, which formed part of the legal foundation for declaring the SS a criminal organization. The supply independence and the practices that flowed from it were discussed as evidence of the SS's status as a state within a state, an organization that had successfully constructed its own parallel government with all the resource-hoarding behaviors that implied. The German Army's own post-war analytical work, much of it conducted under American military supervision as part of the effort to extract operational lessons from the Eastern Front, dealt more obliquely with the supply friction. Wehrmacht generals writing for the U.S. Army Historical Division in the late 1940s and early 1950s were generally reluctant to focus extensively on the SS supply problem. Partly, this was the natural instinct of officers trying to present the German military in the most professional light possible. Partly, it reflected genuine uncertainty about how much of what had happened could be documented versus remembered. The paper trail was fragmentary. Many records had been destroyed in the final weeks of the war. Testimony from SS officers was complicated by their legal situations and self-protective instincts. But the theme emerges consistently enough in those writings to establish that it was a real operational problem and not a post-war fabrication. Senior Wehrmacht officers describing the challenges of coalition management on the Eastern Front consistently identified the dual command structure as one of the most serious operational handicaps they faced. And the supply dimension was central to that critique. The historical scholarship that developed from the 1960s onward, particularly the West German historical establishment's gradually more honest engagement with the military history of the Third Reich, began to excavate the documentary record more systematically. Historians working in the Bundesarchiv found the complaint documents, the after-action reports, the logistics investigations. They contextualized them within the broader literature on German military organization and the competing power centers of the Nazi state. What that scholarship established was a picture of an institutional conflict that was not incidental to German military failure, but actually integral to it. The Wehrmacht and SS were not just occasionally failing to cooperate, they were structurally designed not to cooperate fully. The Nazi state's deliberate cultivation of competing power centers, which kept any one institution from accumulating enough authority to challenge Hitler's supremacy, also meant that two of the primary fighting organizations of that state were perpetually in tension with each other over resources, credit, and institutional survival. The ammunition hoarding was one expression of that structural reality. The failure to develop adequate winter clothing for the 1941 campaign was another. Rooted in similar organizational dysfunction. The inability to coordinate logistics effectively across army group boundaries was another. The German military machine that looked so formidable from the outside, and that was in many ways genuinely capable at the tactical level, was riddled with systemic dysfunctions at the operational and strategic levels that flowed directly from the political structure of the state it served. The SS ammunition practices did not lose the war in the East by themselves. The war was lost for many reasons, most of them larger than supply depot arguments between colonels and Hauptsturmführers. But every instance where Wehrmacht formations went into combat with insufficient ammunition because SS units had declined to share available stocks represents a real degradation of German military capability. Multiply those instances across 3 years of the most intense ground combat in history, and the cumulative effect becomes significant. You cannot calculate exactly how many more Soviet positions might have been taken, how many more German defensive lines might have held longer, how many more soldiers on both sides might or might not have survived if the supply cooperation had been genuine, rather than nominal. But you can say with confidence that the friction was real, the consequences were real, and the structural causes were built into the foundations of the institution that created both organizations. The human dimension of this story deserves more attention than it typically receives in the operational histories. Because behind every logistics document and every complaint filed with an Army Group headquarters, there were men, Wehrmacht infantrymen, checking their magazine pouches and finding them lighter than they needed to be. Artillery battery commanders rationing their remaining shells and calculating how many fire missions they could support before they would have to go silent. Panzer crew commanders knowing their tank carried fewer rounds than doctrine required because the resupply had not come through. Those men did not care about the organizational theory behind their situation. They did not have access to the administrative documents. They just knew that somewhere in the rear area, there were supplies that were not reaching them, and that the institution responsible for holding those supplies wore different collar tabs and answered to different bosses. The resentment that created did not require ideological framing to be intense. Soldiers running low on ammunition while watching someone else's supply convoy roll by understand the situation in terms that need no scholarly analysis. The SS soldiers, for their part, also existed in a specific human context that shaped how they experienced these dynamics. They had been told from the moment they entered SS training that they were the best, that they were elite, that they were fighting for something beyond mere national survival, that they were the vanguard of a new civilization. That framing created both extraordinary unit cohesion and extraordinary institutional insularity. SS units were extraordinarily effective at taking care of their own, in part because they had been trained to see their own as fundamentally distinct from everyone else. That distinction, which produced great tactical cohesion, also produced the supply hoarding behaviors that made joint operations with Wehrmacht formations so consistently difficult. There was a personal and interpersonal dimension to this as well. The officer relationships between SS and Wehrmacht commanders ranged from occasionally collegial to deeply hostile, and those personal dynamics influenced how supply disputes played out in practice. When an SS division commander and a Wehrmacht corps commander had an effective working relationship, supply cooperation was more likely to function. When they didn't, the institutional machinery provided both sides with ample mechanisms for obstruction, denial, and delay. The rank structure incompatibilities between the two organizations also generated friction at the personal level. SS ranks did not map cleanly onto Wehrmacht equivalents. An SS brigade Führer might be commanding a formation equivalent to a Wehrmacht division, but his relationship to the surrounding army structure was ambiguous in ways that complicated normal military interactions. Wehrmacht officers who expected to give orders to their structural subordinates sometimes found themselves in confrontations with SS officers who disputed whether they were actually subordinates at all. These disputes over authority were never fully resolved and created persistent friction at every echelon, from senior command to the supply depot level. One additional dimension worth examining is the question of how captured and shared ammunition affected actual tactical outcomes in ways that can be traced in the record. Because while the macro-level picture of supply friction is relatively well documented at the organizational level, the tactical consequences are harder to trace with precision. There are, however, documented cases where the connection between supply denial and tactical failure is clear enough to be analytically credible. The defensive battles around Orel in the summer of 1943, following the failure of Kursk, produced several instances where Army infantry divisions holding positions against Soviet assault were unable to maintain their fire rates because ammunition for their machine guns and infantry mortars had fallen below sustainable levels. Post-battle analyses by Army Corps headquarters noted that adjacent SS formations had not experienced the same ammunition shortfalls and had declined requests for emergency transfers from their reserves. The positions that were lost in that period, and the casualties they generated, cannot be attributed solely to the ammunition situation. Soviet pressure was intense, and the German defensive posture was structurally compromised, but the supply situation was a documented contributing factor in at least several cases. The 1944 defensive battles in the Baltic states produced similarly suggestive documentation. Army Group North, fighting to hold connections to Estonia and Latvia in the face of massive Soviet offensives, operated with chronic ammunition shortfalls that were repeatedly noted in operational records. The SS formations in the same theater, including substantial Latvian and Estonian SS divisions, as well as German SS formations, operated with somewhat better supply states, because their parallel supply chains were functioning more effectively than the Army supply system under the stress of retreat. Requests from Army formations for supply coordination produced inconsistent results, with some documented cases of SS-controlled depots being inaccessible to Wehrmacht supply officers who needed access to common-caliber ammunition stocks held within them. By this stage of the war, the practical distinction between ideological supply hoarding and simple institutional self-preservation had largely dissolved. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it at some level. The rational response to that reality, if you accepted that institutional survival was the goal, was to ensure your own formation had what it needed to survive the next day, rather than sharing with adjacent formations whose survival was uncertain. The ideology that had originally driven SS supply separatism had been overtaken by a more basic survival logic that produced similar behaviors from both institutions. The difference was that by 1944, the SS supply chain was still marginally more functional than the Wehrmacht's, which meant SS formations still had something to hoard, while Wehrmacht formations were increasingly having nothing to request from. The final months of the war on the Eastern Front in early 1945 essentially dissolved the organizational distinctions that had structured the previous 4 years of conflict. German forces retreating toward the Reich itself were fragmented, mixed, and operating without the supply infrastructure that had made the institutional friction possible in the first place. SS and Wehrmacht units that had spent years in careful organizational separation were thrown together in mixed battle groups, Kampfgruppen, that combined whoever was available regardless of institutional origin. The ammunition that existed was shared not out of institutional generosity, but out of simple necessity. When there is almost nothing left and everyone is about to be overrun, the question of which depot belongs to which organization becomes academic. This final dissolution is in some ways the most revealing moment of the entire story. The institutional barriers that had seemed so rigid, so permanent, so built into the fundamental structure of the German war machine, evaporated almost instantly when the organizational framework that supported them collapsed. What remained were soldiers, running, fighting, dying, sharing the last of whatever they had, because the alternative was worse. The ideology that had justified 3 years of supply separation could not survive contact with its own consequences. What does this history actually mean? Not in terms of lessons for modern military organization, though those lessons are real and have been studied carefully by military historians and planners in the decades since, but in terms of what it reveals about the nature of the conflict and the nature of the state that prosecuted it. The Third Reich was a state that deliberately cultivated internal competition and parallel power structures as a mechanism of political control. Hitler's genius, such as it was, lay partly in his understanding that competing institutions were less likely to combine against him than consolidated ones. By maintaining the SS as a rival to the Wehrmacht, by keeping the Nazi Party apparatus in competition with the state bureaucracy, by encouraging his senior subordinates to compete with each other for his favor, he ensured that no single power center could accumulate enough authority to challenge his position. That was politically effective. It was operationally catastrophic. The ammunition hoarding on the Eastern Front was not just a supply problem. It was a symptom of a fundamental structural dysfunction that ran through every aspect of the German war effort. It was the practical military expression of a state that had traded organizational coherence for political control and paid for that trade on the coldest and most brutal battlefield in human history. The Wehrmacht soldiers who ran short of ammunition because SS depots were closed to them were not victims of individual wickedness or even individual ideology. They were victims of a system designed to serve one man's political survival at the expense of everything else, including the effectiveness of the very war machine that man's ambitions had created. And the SS soldiers who maintained those closed depots were not simply villains in a clean moral drama. They were men who had been thoroughly shaped by an institution that told them their separateness was both their defining virtue and their responsibility to maintain. They acted in accordance with what they had been made to be. The tragedy is that what they had been made to be was fundamentally incompatible with the operational requirements of the war they were fighting. The history of why Waffen-SS units refused to share ammunition caches with Wehrmacht divisions on the Eastern Front is ultimately a history about what happens when ideology becomes logistics. When the political structure of a state is so deeply embedded in its military organization that the operational consequences cannot be separated from the ideological causes. When the question of who gets the bullets is not merely a question of supply management, but a statement about who belongs and who doesn't, who is valued and who isn't, who will be protected by the system and who will be left to manage with what they have. That question was asked and answered thousands of times on the Eastern Front between 1941 and 1945. The answers were rarely comfortable, the consequences were always real, and the story of those answers and those consequences is one that the history of the Second World War cannot be honestly told without.